William, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. It's great to be here.
So for the listener, William and I met. It was so funny. This last NAMM, I think we met at the Apogee party in Santa Monica initially. We had several mutual friends, and then it's so funny because I just kept running into you over and over and over again. Usually at those things, you meet somebody once and you don't see them, for another year. But I just
or you're looking for somebody and you never see them.
And you never see
them. Yeah, right, exactly. So it's very serendipitous how you run into people. So yeah, we did bump into each other a lot. It was fun.
So that's how we met. And I think, listener, you'll find that based on what we're about to talk about and the journey William's been on, he is more than qualified to be on this show. So we'll get cracking. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, affectionately known as the cigarette and underwear capital of the world because Reynolds Tobacco is there and Hanes Hosiery is there. So it's a beautiful southern town. And one of the great things about it in terms of a place to grow up, it was obviously back in the day where, we rode our bikes everywhere and your parents didn't know where you were till you came home for supper, the good old days. But because of the financial influence of those companies and the families that were part of those companies, Reynolds Tobacco and Hanes Hosiery, there was sort of extra culture in the town. So, there was an amazing symphony orchestra. I went to the opera as a kid, saw all kinds of amazing art. The Reynolds family had an amazing American art collection, all this other kind of stuff. So I was exposed to a lot of stuff that you might think would be happening in larger cities. But because of this situation, the culture there was great. But I still grew up in a wonderful sort of Southern hospitality kind of vibe down there. So it was really, really a great spot to be.
Were your parents smokers?
No, well, they were at one point.
Yeah.
But we literally used to wake up to the smell of tobacco because the Reynolds, factories were just, all around. And I got to tour one as a child, the one that made Camel cigarettes. And they had a machine that I was fascinated by that had a huge roll of the paper. And as the paper rolled off, it was folded to capture tobacco that was laid into it and then sealed at the end, chopped into filterless Camel cigarettes. But the cigarette was about a mile long at its peak. So it was just making like thousands and thousands and thousands of cigarettes over and over again. So it was kind of amazing technology.
No, we know the smell of cigarette smoke. Many people do. They're very familiar with that. What about the smell of tobacco leaves in the field? Is that a different smell?
I think it is. It's not. I think once they start cultivating the tobacco and dry it and put all the crap in it that we found out later they were putting into it, it has a particular smell, but it's definitely not like the burn smell, which is so funny because we all grew up around people smoking cigarettes. And I remember, going out to clubs and seeing music, and you'd always come home and all your clothes would smell like smoke, even if you didn't smoke. And when they stopped allowing that, I remember I didn't really notice till then how bad, your leather jacket smelled like smoke, like all the time. So it's a funny thing. But yeah, from the tobacco processing plants, we could smell a general tobacco smell, which is probably the same tobacco smell they put in fancy candles now. You have the some brand candle that's supposed to smell something, and they have tobacco in that stuff.
Brothers or sisters?
Yeah, older sister.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, so we and my parents. My father was a banker, worked for a little regional bank in North Carolina called Wachovia Bank that no longer exists.
Yeah.
And my mother was a school teacher, and so we moved around quite a bit in North Carolina. So we're in Winston-Salem, Salisbury, Asheville, then back to Winston-Salem. And so got to know the state. We'd move like every 2 or 3 years. My father's job as he worked his way up the ladder, they would place him around the state. So no, it was a great childhood. And I loved being down there. Even though I'm a diehard New Yorker now, I still have a soft spot for the South.
What about music in the home? Exposure from either your sister or your parents? Did that exist?
Sort of a combination of both. I remember my dad had in our house in, I think it was in Salisbury, there was a sort of, how people build a little closet or something under the stairwell. Well, that's where the stereo was. And I believe it was a Fisher tube amp with a Girard turntable, but then in the wall next to the staircase was just built in one big mono speaker. And that was sort of the stereo for the house. And so, he would listen to like folk groups like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and trying to think I can't think of the name of this other group, but anyway, they sang a song about Tom Dooley being hung that I remember very well as a child. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Anyway, and then my parents were both very into like the stuff they'd grown up with, sort of big band stuff and all that kind of stuff. So, part of accessing the culture in Winston-Salem was because of them. They would take me to see stuff. And so that was, so there was that musical influence. And then, of course, having an older sister, in the late 60s and through the 70s and everything, she'd get the albums, I'd steal them, we would fight over them. I would scratch one, the usual. And she would turn me on to, she turned me on to Bruce Springsteen. She turned me on to a whole bunch to Terry Reid. I don't know if you know Terry Reid, but a great record that he made back in the 70s. And, then I was listening to everything from, I was a huge James Taylor fan, Crosby, Stills and Nash, but then Grand Funk Railroad to Al Green to the Jackson 5 to Frank Zappa, sort of all rolled into one thing. So one of the nice things about getting to work with a lot of different genres now is that that's what I was sort of listening to growing up. I never really got fixated on one particular thing.
What about school band? Any involvement as a player in school?
Well, the first time I started officially taking any kind of lessons was when I'm not sure how old I was, probably 9 or 10, but the song Wipeout was a big hit and there's a drum fill. And so I decided I wanted to be a drummer. So I went and took drum lessons at the local music store. And that didn't last very long. I remember having one of those cool little drum pads to practice my paradiddles on. And then, but the obvious draw of the guitar and the singer-songwriter took me to get my first guitar. And in school, we did stuff like chorus and stuff like that, but never really formed a rock band in the early years. It really, because especially since I was sort of being singer-songwriter guy, I was kind of on my own and started playing at coffee houses in North Carolina, in Winston-Salem, probably around 7th grade, 8th grade, something like that. And, it was an interesting crew because Peter Holzapfel from the DBs was a couple years older than me. So he would have bands playing and Will Rigby was there and Mitch Easter was around. So it turned out that a lot of people that would play the Knollwood Coffee House behind the Knollwood Baptist Church on Saturday night ended up staying in the music business.
What about your parents? Were they, how did they feel about music and the culture of music? Were they conservative and in that respect?
I think that they were interested in music in a cultural level, but as most parents would be, not interested in it as a career for their son. Coming from, being Depression era children who, their main concern was, steady income, raising a family, all that kind of stuff. So they were incredibly encouraging, but probably hoping it was some sort of phase. I remember when I was in the 7th grade, I connected with a guy, I'm trying to think of his name. Ronnie Hunter was his name. And he was an older guy, blues player, definitely from a different world than me. And we got together and started playing. And we went to the local college radio station at Wake Forest University, was WFDD. And we went and played on FDD one night. And, I don't know, how old are you in the 7th grade? Like 13 or something? I don't even know the right age. But but I remember, we played at like midnight. And I remember my parents waiting up for me and like probably thinking at this point of like, uh-oh, maybe this is, maybe he's getting serious about this. And then I partnered with a great singer named Emily Allred, and we got to open for Doc Watson when he played at Waite Chapel at Wake Forest. And that was a really big deal for me because he was a great hero of mine, still is, of course. And so, yeah, little inklings starting to happen in junior high school that a band would be a cool thing to do, but really sort of form my first band later in high school and then on into college, had a bunch of bands.
When did the world of recording or production or the awareness of the record making process. When did that like hit your radar? When did you become aware of it?
When I was in junior high school, my summer job was at Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, and it was a hilarious job because in the old days of pre-digital, all the X-rays were analog, and they had to, by law, keep them for 8 years. But every 8 years, they had to get rid of the X-rays. But of course, the X-rays were made out of some toxic plastic or something. So the job I had was sitting in a basement with two giant barrels and pulling the X-rays out of the plastic sleeves and putting the X-rays in one barrel and the paper in the other. And it was hilarious. And, I met all these people that were the sort of the underlying workforce of a hospital. And there were all these characters and really interesting people. But one guy I met was a year older than me and was a musician. His name is Byron Hill. And Byron worked upstairs in the pharmacy, I think. I wish I'd put two and two together and thought it would be good to have a friend in the pharmacy, but I didn't know anything about drugs in those days. And but Byron was a guitar player and a songwriter, so we started talking. And as the summer progressed, I got moved up into doing things in the X-ray special procedure area, so I would see Byron more often. So in his house, in his little apartment, he had, can't think of the brand of it, maybe let's just say an Akai, 1/4-inch stereo recorder, but it had a switch on it called sound on sound. So you could record mono on one side, then you could roll it back and record mono on the other side. And he literally had cardboard egg cartons on his wall and a couple of mics. So we started co-writing songs together, wrote a bunch of songs together, and we made an 8-song album using this technique where we would play guitar and sing, the two of us, once, and then play guitar and sing, the two of us, again, and split the two channels in stereo. So I still have that tape somewhere. I need to get it baked and transfer it to digital. But Byron has amazingly gone on to be a record executive, producer, hit songwriter, and just a real top of the Nashville game. He's lived in Nashville for a long time and remains a close friend, but he's done super well in the music business. So anyway, that was my first exposure to recording anything. And then I think, I had a jug band or something and we recorded on somebody had a tape recorder, but that was really about it. And of course, in those days, to put out a record was beyond any of our knowledge or concern. We weren't doing anything with that. So it really took until high school that I started learning more about recording and sort of jumping ahead. When I was a senior in high school, I went away to boarding school in Maine for my last 2 years of high school, which was a unique experience for a North Carolinian to go to the middle of Maine and experience that much snow and that much cold. But also it was a small kind of cool liberal arts co-ed school, and I was very into rock climbing and mountaineering, so they had a program with that. So that's one reason I wanted to go there. But I corralled all the musicians in this small 200 student school, and it was ninth through 12th grade, and formed a band. And so we would do every semester we'd do a variety show that the band was the core, and I would play all my songs, and other people I would sort of curate who else got to play. And, we would put, if there were 3 French horn players, we'd put them in with the band, whoever played anything, we would do it, which was great fun. And one of the kids I met at school who's not a musician was a guy named Tim Gavin. And Tim, his father, Kevin Gavin, was a jingle writer in New York. So he wrote "You Deserve a Break Today" for McDonald's, "The Name Like Smokers, It's Gotta Be Good," the NBC sports theme, blah, blah, blah. And his corral of talent that he worked with was Barry Manilow and Melissa Manchester and Rupert Holmes, who went on to great fame, not only for the Pina Colada song, but for writing like 3 different Broadway shows. So he, in those days, you had to demo the jingle before you got the gig. So he would have to go to some big studio and pay big money to do it. So he wanted a demo studio in his office in the Gray Bar building right above Grand Central Station. So we had this thing called a senior May project at school. They give you the last month of the year off to go do something educational that you cooked up. So we presented this idea. They bought it. we headed to New York City. And I'd been to New York a couple times before, but never for an extended period. So I was in heaven. I was fascinated just to get to walk to Grand Central every morning and look at the Chrysler building. My mind was completely blown. And so we put this studio together, and I wish the only component I remember is a Scully half-inch 4-track tape machine, which of course I wish I had to this day, because that was a beautiful machine. But anyway, we spent the month doing that and recording demos in there and making sure it all worked. And then during that time, I got to go with Kevin to some big recording sessions, like for doing a Pepsi jingle at A&R Studios, in their studio, either 1 or A. But seeing that process of a guy record the 8-track, 2-track, and mono at the same time, mixing as they went, and they would do 10 versions of a jingle in like 6 hours. And it'd be like, okay, now we're doing the folk jingle. And like musicians would walk in, acoustic guitar, whatever. They'd do like 3 takes, done. Now we're doing the R&B version. Guy would come in on B3, bunch of background singers. They do that. Now we're doing the soft version. String section would walk in, but it was all like this. It was all, and it blew my mind. I was like, I've never seen anything like this. So that pretty much gave me a spark of there was this possibility, instead of being a musician, of being on the other side of all that and being able to record stuff. So one of the great things that happened there was there's a studio in New York. I don't think it's still here. I think it's long gone, but a place called Howard Schwartz Recording. And that was right across the hall. And that was a real pro jingle house. So we got to spend some time over there, which, as the story progresses, comes back into my life and makes a big difference in terms of a job that I get.
Based on your experience, for the up and coming listener, could you maybe give an overarching view of what you think the major differences are between a jingle session versus just like making a record?
Yeah, I think in the jingle world, they were very interested in it moving extraordinarily fast because of cost. Studio costs were very high. And I think the ad agencies, that by the time the jingle was written, I'm not sure if the cost, would assume the cost would switch from the jingle writer to the advertising house that had hired them to do the jingle, that the jingle writer wouldn't pay them. But they were just like that Pepsi session I described. They want everything to go very fast. So the engineering skills were such that you weren't like, let's get a kick sound and like spend 20 minutes figuring that out. That had to be figured out long before anybody walked in the door. And it was all super session players. So everybody sounded great. So, basically they'd want the artists to walk in. The session players to walk in and just knock these things out. And it was all charted out, written in advance. And yeah, so I think a jingle session would do 10 versions of a jingle in a 6-hour session, where making an album, you maybe have just gotten the snare sound, after the first 6 hours. And obviously making an album is a much more creation on the spot kind of project, where a jingle would be everything hatched out, figured out. And the players knew the genres really well, so they could switch between different genres to make the different jingles.
Do you think that there's a, knowing what you know of Nashville sessions and how rapidly those sessions move, do you think that there's a similarity between jingle sessions and how Nashville sessions run?
Yeah, I think nobody in Nashville would want their great country song compared to a jingle, obviously, but I think the progression is very similar. I did it. I'm jumping way ahead now, but just to match with that, I had not really experienced the Nashville situation that much, and I went down to record a song with Tennille Arts, and we had a 10 o'clock start at Soundstage with my great friend Nick Autry, and so she came in and her manager came in and we chatted, and part of my job as producer was to, get everybody feeling good and chat until we wait. And about an hour goes by. We're all set up. We've gotten instrumentation from her and everything and what she wanted. And I said, well, what time's the band going to get here? Because we were ready to roll. And she said, I don't know. What time is the band going to get here? And I thought, oh boy. So they thought we were hiring the band. We thought she was bringing her band. But what relates to what you were saying is that Nick Autry, being the genius in the end, is like, wait a minute, man, hold on a second. And he goes in his office, he comes back with a spreadsheet, and he says, I've got these 3 guys in Studio B, they're done at 4 o'clock. These 5 other guys can do this. And basically, he just rearranged the whole thing and got the most amazing players on the planet for like 6 o'clock that evening. So he and I went out had a nice lunch, I had a nap, and came back, and we did this great session. And it turned out some of those guys were playing on another session that I did with Breland like 3 days later. But the engineering technique, the Pro Tools op technique in that was so amazing and as a producer, it was weird because the band just kind of takes over. These guys all know each other, and they're like, they do one, I'd say we did maybe 2 practice takes. Then on the 3rd take, they're like, they do it all the way through, and then whoever's the director says, okay, Bob, I think you messed up around this part, and Joe, okay. So they meter out who does overdubs on the next pass. And I'm just kind of standing there going like, do I get to say anything? Like, I think that pass was good. I don't know. This is moving really fast. And so the engineer has to, just record the pedal steel player and the bass player and the drummer at specific things, but all in one take, all in one pass. So my mind was blown. I'm sorry for not remembering the engineer tape up on this session. He was amazing. But anyway, it definitely related to that sort of jingle world of just like, let's do it. And everybody is so steeped in all different genres. You can just mention, this should sound like this. And the guy just changes his guitar tone and figures out something for that either period of time. If you say, I want it to sound like something from 1965, the guy's like, got it right here. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And what interests me really about that is I told Nick that if we had been in New York or LA, that session would have been canceled. I mean, we would have had to regroup like 3 days later to figure all that out. But the infrastructure is there in Nashville to make that happen. And it's just amazing. My mind was blown. And the tracks just came out like mind-blowingly good.
Yeah. They're like assassins.
Just unbelievable. It was, my mouth was hanging open the whole time.
Yeah.
It was great.
Going back to the jingle thing in New York.
Yeah.
Do you feel that was a pivotal time for you in decision-making of the rest of your life in terms of whether or not you were going to go down maybe a path of being a musician or being a producer and an engineer?
I think what it did is it showed me that other possibility. I think it took a minute for me to push aside the sort of singer-songwriter rock star thing and decide that this was maybe a better way for me to go. But it definitely opened that door. I would never have known as much as, just in that 1 month I was there between building the studio, going to the big time jingle sessions and meeting the people at Howard Schwartz recording across the hall, just showed me that there was this whole world that's, a real job of doing cool stuff. And of course, later on, I realized that producing let me mix the musical part in with the, making records part.
Yeah. That was that particular New York experience. That was at the end of your boarding school time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was the end of my senior year in high school. Sorry.
Senior year in high school. Okay. Did you go to college?
I did. After I graduated from high school, my parents were very interested in me going to college. Since I had planned on being a rock star, I didn't really know why I needed to go to college. But a teacher at boarding school had sparked this interest in political science and economics, which I'm both very interested in today. So my parents wanted me to come back home. So I went to University of North Carolina at Greensboro because they had a music program. So I was a music major, but I minored or dabbled in political science and economics. And what happened, and I had a full-time band. So doing my original material. So it was a great year and a great learning experience. But the main thing I learned is that I wasn't interested in studying political science and economics because, there's always that situation where you have this one amazing, impactful teacher that like blows your mind. Mm-hmm. He's so good. Clifford Hobbins, if you're listening, this is you I'm talking about. He's still teaching. And, you get all fired up about a particular subject. And then, of course, I had like crappy grad school students teaching, and it didn't have the same impact. And this was a classical music department. So one of the nice things that happened there is they funneled all the, rock and folk guitar players into playing classical guitar because that was the instrument you chose. But I got to study a lot of theory and had a really intriguing composition teacher that made me think more and more about writing instrumental music and composing music for film, which I did a little bit later on. But my real goal, if I was to stay in college, was to get to Berklee College of Music. At the time, sort of the only place that was teaching music in a jazz tradition as opposed to a classical tradition. And it was long, long before they had their recording program. So I did 1 year at University of North Carolina and then transferred to Berklee College of Music, where I lasted officially 2 years, but about a year and a half. I didn't last long. And that was an experience that I think you were asking about, sort of path changing experiences. When I got to Berklee, as the, strummy, sensitive guitar player, I was confronted with like 2,500 people that were unbelievable guitar players.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, shit. Like, these people practice like all day. I'm not really interested in doing that. I'm kind of a lazy musician, and all this stuff. So I was like, uh-oh, this is maybe, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I did a little playing around Boston, never really had a band. I think I had a sort of folky trio for a minute, played a couple of clubs there. But then, as I mentioned before, this situation in New York, I met the folks at Howard Schwartz Recording. So during my third semester at Berklee, I attended a lecture by a guy named Ross Sabella, who was a studio owner in Boston. He owned recording studios. So I don't know what class I was in or why it came up on the radar. So he talked about how he started his studios. He was doing jingles at this one location. He just bought a second location that was a rock and roll music studio. And he showed his track sheets and his different things that he had and talked about branding. And then he said, but the reason I have all this and know all this is because I stole everything from my friend Howard Schwartz in New York at Howard Schwartz Recording. So I'm like, wait a minute, I know that guy. So after the lecture, this gives me a talking point, some way to introduce myself to the guy. So I go up to Ross and I say, hey, I know Howard Schwartz. We start talking, blah, blah, blah. And then I sort of say, if you need any help with your new place, let me know. And he says, okay, be in touch. So I wrote him a letter, and I got hired as the janitor of Intermedia Sound on Newbury Street, literally the janitor, because he had nobody to clean the bathrooms and sweep the floors. And that's the first job I got in the recording business. So I went to work there as I sort of faded out of school. And that was my first real job. I mean, I didn't make enough money there, so I drove cab on the side and did a bunch of other stuff. But that was my introduction to being in a recording studio.
I just want to stop and highlight that interaction. Hi, I know Howard Schwartz, blah, 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 blah. Right. Just that the act of that's kind of like, I talk a lot about networking on the show, and I talk a lot about, just, advocating for yourself. And that there you are at a young age doing that. And obviously,
for me, it was almost more out of amazement. It was half like advocating for myself, but more like, I got to tell this guy, like, this is hilarious. This is very weird that we both know this person. So I think part of it was that. And, part of it was, definitely not afraid to speak out and say hi and kind of throw in at the end, hey, if you've got anything going on. And and it was great.
But obviously, I'm sure have excelled at that in your career, that ability to network, that ability to just be open and talk to people.
Yeah, it definitely comes in handy. I always credit my parents with being very well socially trained, but also just have an eagerness to chat with people and find out what they're like and what they're doing. So definitely, if I think about all the different connections that have led me to where I am, most of them are about knowing somebody or somebody knowing somebody that knows me, that connects me to a particular situation.
That's right.
In fact, everyone really. I've never applied for a job ever. Wow. I still don't have a resume. I tried to figure that out a couple of months ago when things changed, and I was like, I don't really know how to do this,
But for the younger listener, I think it's important for them to hear that ability to hang, to talk to people, to just acquire allies, if you will.
Yeah, and it I think for me it really stems with a genuine, curiosity about people and wanting to listen to what they're doing. And I'm always driven crazy about people you meet and all they do is talk about themselves. I tend to be the other way around, where I'd rather hear what you're doing. And certainly if you ask, I'll, like in this very situation, I'll talk about myself. But otherwise, yeah, I'll indulge you, right? But I mean, so. And you've seen me at NAMM now with those skills honed after thousands of years, and it's like I'm like having the ball. So many great people to talk to and meet. It's just so much fun.
Well, so you're the janitor. Where does that take you to? What doors open? How do you seize on that opportunity?
It just allowed me to be around. There was I think I don't remember who. Back in those days, people were kind of staff engineers opposed to being more freelance, but there was an engineer at Intermediate Sound named Bob Schott. And Bob has gone on he basically did all the Sesame Street stuff for like the last 30 years. And amazing guy. He's still in New York. I see him every now and again. And he, sort of mentored me, let me sit down in sessions, taught me stuff. The original console was some sort of a custom made console that had no EQ in it. So on the wall in a rack were 18 Lang and Pultec EQs, which I wish I had taken them all home with me. And then we had an MM1000 16-track tape machine. And which I don't know if you know that, but it's, every channel has a thing the size of a hi-fi receiver, and they're 8 on top and 8 on the bottom. It's about 4 or 5 feet wide. The tape reels look tiny on it. It's a huge behemoth of a machine, and no auto locators in those days. So you had to figure out what you were doing on the tape. But anyway, Bob was really instrumental in me getting ahead. And then in those days, at least where I was, there wasn't so much an assistant engineer now like there is now. You kind of did everything yourself, on your own as an engineer. You went out and set up all the mics, you did all the stuff. So there weren't that many sort of avenues to, people on my level are more like running out and getting things or running downstairs to fetch a microphone stand or something like that. But I got to do a lot of that stuff. And one of the first sessions that I got to witness there was with Burt Bacharach and Carly Simon. And Burt was recording an album called Woman with his wife, Libby Titus, his wife at the time, Libby Titus, who's a singer. And they recorded the basics with the Houston Symphony Orchestra. And we're going around the country recording various people on the track. So Carly Simon lived with James Taylor at the time on Martha's Vineyard. So Boston was the closest place where they could come to a pro studio. So, and I was a huge James Taylor fan, as I said before, and Carly Simon. So just the whole thing was just blowing my mind. At 19 years old, I was like freaking out. And I was literally the little man in the room. So they came in, super nice. Carly was super nice and chatted with me for a minute, which, just sent me into a puddle. And then but what was cool is the engineer came from LA. I have no idea who he is, but I was probably on the record. I should look it up. But he brought like an attaché case with microphones in it. And I'd never seen anybody like carry their own microphones. And I thought, this is super cool. I wish I knew what they were, maybe a 414, maybe something else. And then he brought an assistant who was a woman, who was a tape op. And she got on this giant MM1000 tape machine and used grease pencil marks on the tape to figure out where the first verse was, the second verse, da da da. So she just sat by the machine and she was the auto locator. So he would say, take me back to the first verse. Boom, right on the money. And I was like, holy crap, this is amazing. Like, how did she figure all this out? Anybody figure all this out? Anyway, so that was the first time I'd seen like super pros, like in the room, just knocking it out. And the great thing about that story, well, one of the things about the story was being the low man on the totem pole. I Burt Bacharach had a shearling jacket and a button had popped off. So I got sent to the tailor to get the button sewed back on. So I got to walk around Boston with Burt Bacharach's jacket, which I thought was pretty much the high point of my career at that time. And anyway, so that was great. And to jump way, 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 way ahead, about 2 years before Burt passed, I was at a party and got to tell him that story. And then just last summer, through a wonderful friend of mine, I was able to go visit Carly Simon at her house and tell her that story. So I got, 40 plus years later, I got to tell both those people that was a big moment in my life. But the other big session we did was Aerosmith came in, and they had recorded Dream On at this studio back in their early days. So this was years after that, and they were, giant band. And they came in, trying to remember the producer. It's somebody that I've talked to about it since, but his name is escaping my brain right now. But I think it was Jack Douglas. I think they'd done a couple of records with Jack, they'd done a record with somebody else. They were coming back in to sort of experiment with Jack again, but don't hold me to that. Anyhow, that was in the studio once it had become Synchro Sound and had been redesigned by John Stewart. And that I saw a whole new professional level. It was when they put amps in separate rooms, like we put amps in the basement. It was before you could do anything wireless, so they would run cables all the way down, all this stuff. Steven Tyler sang in the control room. I'd never seen anybody do that before. Joe Perry played in the control room, and I'd never seen anybody do that before. So again, that was a big pivotal moment. One thing I skipped is that Intermedia Sound eventually was bought by the Cars and became Synchro Sound in the early 80s.
Right.
And so once I went freelance after a couple 3 years working there with a detour through Century 3, their other studio. Anyway, it became Synchro, and that's where I did a lot of my freelance stuff. But the way the arc from Intermedia worked was that from sweeping the floor to sort of assisting, I don't know if they ever hired another janitor while I was there, but finally they promoted me to go to the jingle studio and become the tape copy guy. So in those days, when you did a jingle, the jingle or an advertisement, come to Joe's Hardware, blah, 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 with music in the background. For it to get on radio, you sent it in a reel-to-reel mono form. Radio station would then transfer it to a cart machine, and they could play the commercials with the carts that looked like big 8-tracks.
Right.
And so somebody had to run off, you finish a commercial, somebody's got to run off 30 copies to go to all the radio stations in the Midwest or something. I think the biggest tape run we did was like 1,500 tape copies, and that's a story in itself. That was a weekend of fun. But anyway, I had a little space in the storage area of the studio with 2 Scully mono machines and a bunch of cassette machines that would just make tape copies all day. But I spoke to the owner of the studio, to Ross, and said, and I was at Berkeley at the time still, I think, or maybe just leaving. And I said, I'm really interested in recording, kind of playing down what I already knew. And since this is a jingle studio that closes at 6, can I come in with my friends and just screw around at night and, make some recordings to get better? He's like, sure, here are the keys, do whatever you want. So my interest at that point was getting my name on something as a producer. And so having the studio access, I could go to a band and say, I've got a record label. I started my own record label called Alpha Media Records. And then would go to a band and say, look, if you pay for the pressing, I'll pay for the recording. Knowing that I could use this place after hours at no cost to me. So I ended up starting to make a couple of records. Released my first record in 1980, a band called The Scam. It was a 45. I even handmade the covers and did the photography and did the typography and everything. And it was the first thing that ever came out that said produced by William Garrett. So that's the way I got my name out there as a producer. And I went on to do, I don't know, 7 or 8 45s and a couple of EPs. And some people would just come to me and say, we've already done the project. Can we just use your label setup? And I would do that. But that went on for probably 5 or 6 years until I left to come to New York. But those overnights, that I did myself were great. And also when clients would want the studio overnight, they would put me on those sessions. So I cut my teeth working on a lot of R&B and hip hop stuff with Michael Johnson and Maurice Starr, who, if you know Boston history, Maurice is credited with New Kids on the New Edition first, and then New Kids on the Block, both of which I worked on back in the day. So those are sort of the first major projects I had to work on. And Michael Johnson had a big hit called Pat Jam. He was the Johnson with a Z crew and those guys. And they would make tracks overnight, the two of them together, and then they'd send them down to Sugar Hill, and Sugar Hill would have people rap over them. And that was in the late 70s, early 80s. So rap was just getting going. And the one that was the biggest one was the Furious Five and the Sugar Hill Gang. It was called, shoot, I just forgot the name of it. But it was like a feud record where they sort of said one was hipper than the other. It was a nice back and forth rap thing. So I'll have to remember the name of it.
Yeah.
It'll come to me.
Gentle compared to nowadays.
Right. Exactly. But,
were you making a living? Did you have other gigs to make money? And did you make any money off this record label?
I know the record label was a total loss. In fact, I talked to a friend of mine's father in investing like $2,500, and he never saw that money ever again. But part of that was probably my bad money management, but also it just paid for pressing a bunch of records, and we didn't really sell any. But it did open up a lot of knowledge about, there were real vinyl distributors in those days. I went to meet them to try to pitch it to European distributors. So I learned a lot about all that world, but it never really made a success. But from the time I got the job at Intermedia Sound, maybe during that beginning time, I drove cab a little bit and did some other stuff. But basically after that, after I went freelance, I never really did anything else. I did have a little stint in the mid 80s as a studio supervisor at Berkeley, which was funny to go back there and be on staff. And, but no, I've never had to do anything else, which is brilliant. That doesn't mean I haven't been eating a lot of tuna fish out of the can with Ritz crackers and not being able to pay my rent, but right. I never fully had to get another job.
So, and I know I'm probably leaping eons ahead here, but
yes, the time continuum is all over the place. But
your whole time doing the Spotify thing, leading up to that, before we talk about that, were those years, I mean, aside from, the studio supervisor position at Berkeley, but were those years spent as a freelancer primarily?
Primarily as a freelancer. The one sort of what I would call sort of a permanent in-house freelance gig was starting in, I think, 1990 or 91. I got a gig running an in-house studio for Sony ATV Music Publishing. So when I first came to New York in the late 80s, some of the first gigs I got were publishing demos. And in those times in the 80s and early 90s, publishing companies would sign bands. They'd sign a band for their publishing, but their goal was to get them a record deal. So they would want to produce record quality demos of what this band was doing. And then the publishing company would shop that to the labels and say, we found this cool band. So when I say doing publishing demos, it's not like, upright piano and two mics, here's the song. It was like full blown, like we're making a record here. Mm-hmm. So I was really lucky when I first came to New York to have a couple friends in the publishing world, Susan Henderson and MCA Music Publishing, and Patty DeVries at Sony ATV. And they put me together with some bands, the first one being the Hepburns, which was a great band. And we recorded at Media Sound. I mixed it right track. So, there were decent budgets, and it was great. And, but that introduced me to the world of publishing. So Patty at Sony ATV, I did have one other gig. I was a house sound guy at a club called Drums on the Upper East Side. That was a great gig, free food and booze, and just mixed great bands every night. Saw some incredible bands there. I saw this band called Mr. Crow's Garden from Atlanta that turned out to be the Black Crows. I remember they played the club that night, and I went on to do some demos. So that's a whole other story that involves Rick Rubin and George Trikulius and all this stuff. But anyway, so Patty said, we should do will you come in, just as an hourly worker and put a studio in our office, which at that time was at 666 Fifth Avenue. And so we did, I think we bought a Tascam 16 track, half-inch machine, probably a Tascam board. They didn't have much dough at that time. And started recording these sort of band demos. And then that eventually moved to 550 Madison Avenue, where Sony was for a long time. And we did, I think we're on 3 different floors as the publishing department moved around. But it started as a part-time thing. I was still doing cool projects with people like John Cale. I recorded the soundtrack to American Psycho and did a couple records with him. And then I can't think of who else I was working with, but some stuff with Cyndi Lauper, some other people. But this was a nice steady gig, and it turned into a pretty 5-day a week. And I even hired a guy to engineer nights because I had young kids and wanted to be at home. But anyway, that was sort of a nice steady run and sort of set me up for jobs in the future of sort of running and being the in-house producer, engineer for these kind of things. So and that was a lot of great people came through that studio. In fact, that was the famous Norah Jones story that I tell over and over again. I just saw her Sunday night here at the Apollo. She was amazing.
Yeah, well, we'll share the story. You got to tell me.
Well, yeah, I got to tell you the story, right? I know Nora's sick of me telling it, but there's a great A&R person at Sony ATV Music named Nate Krinkle, and he signed Conor Oberst, who I got to work with, who I just saw recently as well, and signed a singer-songwriter named Jesse Harris. And Jesse wrote these sort of quirky, smart, really cool songs. And they were trying to figure out like who else would record these songs. So Jesse had been on tour and had been in Texas and had met this singer named Norah Jones. And so as they became friendly, Norah decided to move to New York. So Nate had an extra room in his apartment. So Norah became Nate from Sony ATV's roommate. So, and she was doing jazz standards, playing around town and not doing any original material, as far as I know. And so the decision was made that Norah should come in and demo Jesse's songs so they could be pitched to jazz singers like Diana Krall and other people like that. So she came in, we recorded, I think, 8 songs in one day, upright piano, kick drum, snare, and like one cymbal, bass and guitar. And one of the songs on that list was called Don't Know Why. And so she recorded that song for the first time. This is in the year 2000. She recorded that song and a couple other songs that went on to become big songs on that date. So that was just something. And then, up there, I got to mix Jesse's records. Mary J. Blige came in. There was an amazing songwriter named Andrea Martin who used the studio all the time. I got to work with. My first Pro Tools session ever was with Chucky Thompson, the great hip hop and R&B producer. So all these great people came through, and it was great. And I got to, as technology changed, I went from the 16-track Tascam that we would lock to a bunch of MIDI gear to then 2 PCM 88s, which are the Sony version of the D88 PC, something like that. And I still have one of those in my basement if anybody wants it. And
I have a door that needs holding.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then went to an O2R, which was Yamaha's first sort of digital studio console. So I got to do that, and that lasted for 15 years. That little studio. Then finally, somebody realized there was a studio in the building and said, we can't do that. And it was like shut down in a day, which made me start my own studio, Electrocraft.
But prior to the Spotify thing, which we went to, if you look at the broad overview of that time period from the school in Maine up to that moment,
right?
What are some of the key takeaways that you could look back on now and say, God, in that time period, these are the key things that I learned about survival or human interaction or just business of the music industry? What are those things that stand out to you?
I mean, I think if I think about that arc, it's really about presence and perseverance and luck and, getting to know good people. I feel like that whenever I've been in a situation that I needed help, I've always had a knowledgeable person to reach out to because I've been out there and been meeting these people all along the way. And, a good example of that is when I first came to New York, a buddy of mine, my best friend Billy, was in this band called Face to Face, and they were doing a record, and Ed Stasium was engineering. So he invited me to the studio. So I met Ed, and we became friends. And his wife at the time, Francine, was managing him. So when I came to New York, I had I got a gig working with somebody in DC or something, and I asked Francine some questions. He goes, let me handle this for you. I'll make sure, you shouldn't be sleeping on their couch in the basement. You should be staying at a hotel if you're going to, you shouldn't be hitchhiking to DC. They should pay your way to DC. And I was like, oh, this stuff I never would have had the nerve to ask for. So all of a sudden she, helped me out with that. And then I remember being at a really low point where I'd lost an apartment on the Lower East Side, classic New York situation where somebody wanted the lease back and we all got thrown out. And I had no idea where to go. And I was basically couch surfing all around New York. And I had previously met a wonderful guy named Jim Phelan, who is famous in the business as a producer, manager, A&R, label executive. And so I saw Jim somewhere and I said, look, I've got no place. I was kind of telling him my situation. And I said, I've got no place to get my mail. And he said, well, just forward everything have it forwarded to my office, and you can come by every 2 or 3 days and pick it up. And I was like, that was super nice. Because, that was pre-email, pre-texting, mail was everything besides a landline phone. So, then I saw him in another place and he said, how you doing? And usually my friends will attest, I'm fairly positive. I'm usually, yeah, it's great. Everything's great. But I said, Jim, I'm fucking starving to death, man. I got nothing. I got no work. And he was like, well, let me see what's happening. So the next day he calls me and there's a record being made at Atlantic Studios, and the engineer producer needs an assistant, needs an engineer. Can you? And I said, sure. And it turned out the producer was Michael Frondelli. He was an amazing producer, engineer, went on to manage Capitol Studios, still in LA. I see him all during awards season. And the record was a solo album by Michael Monroe, who's the lead singer of the band Hanoi Rocks.
Mm-hmm.
And they had already cut the basics with incredible players, and they were doing guitar and vocal and keyboard overdubs. So because of Jim, I ended up with this gig making a record at Atlantic Studios. And so again, back to your initial question, just the fact that I was out there, just the fact that I'd made these acquaintances, and then at this point in time, didn't hesitate to ask for help. I got it.
Was
and of
that
course
to ask?
A little bit, yeah, because my friend Amy and I always call it jolly automatic. We're Southern, and you're always jolly. You can't let that facade down. So it's kind of one of the first and only times I'd ever said to somebody, I'm actually not really doing that good. I need a gig. And Jim was amazingly helpful. So by asking that question, you sort of kickstarted in my brain all these people that, and then Ed Stasium recommends me for a gig engineering with Rick Rubin. And, I don't know what to charge. So I called Jim Phelan. Jim Phelan says, this is how much guys are charging per hour to do this kind of a session. So, and nobody asked for a percentage. Nobody asked for anything. They were just like, we're going to help, and that's been happening to me lately. So it still seems to be a thing. So, but the Rick Rubin thing was a good experience, which leads back, remember, Counting Crows, Mr. Crow's Garden, George Trakoulias. It all comes from this gig that Ed recommended me for was it was working with Slayer. Mm-hmm. So Rick wanted to make a 12-inch remix of Slayer songs from Rain and Blood for the European market. So vinyl, these were days of vinyl, of course. So 12-inch remix. So we were going to take, I think, 3 songs from Rain and Blood, because, they're all speed metally, 2-minute songs. And on that record, they all kind of run together on Rain and Blood. So um, I was, we booked Studio B at Electric Lady, and we took the Andy Wallace recorded 2-inch tapes, copied them to another 2-inch machine, then used razor blades and cut them all to pieces and made this expansive, insane, like 12-minute track. And then Slayer was in town playing at L'Amour's, the famous metal club that's no longer on Long Island. And they came in and re-recorded certain parts so that it was a little bit different. And we had this really cool cutting edge device called a Lindrum that was a sampling Lindrum.
Wow.
So we put the samples from the Andy Wallace recordings in this thing, and with the fingers, the guy reconfigured his drum parts. And we did guitar solos. And it was great. They were hilarious guys, and we just had a ball. And George was Rick's assistant at the time. And then he went on to work at A&M Records, and then he came to see me at the club the night that Mr. Crow's Garden played. He signed him to A&M Records and made the first record with them.
Made the Black Crowes first record.
Oh, yeah, the Black Crowes record, yeah, the breakthrough record for them, yeah. So, and we did some demos right before that. They sounded more like REM than the Black Crowes, but they were really good. But anyway, again, I seem to be weaving a path of serendipity, but always with having these relationships with people that have always in turn been very generous and very nice to me. So I can't be more grateful to all these folks that have played a role.
So on continuing on that message of networking and people, what would you say, whether to the pros that listen or whether to the up and comers that are listening, what would you say is it's interacting with people in these situations, everybody's inundated with, hey, help me do this, help me do that. People who just have these, ridiculous expectations of people who have put in the work.
Right.
So how did you interact with these people? You're Southern by nature, so there's I'm sure
there's a how you do it. There's a how you doing factor, as we like to call it. You're just
Can you talk about a bit about that?
Well, I think one thing you said that is, a lot of people are inundated with people asking for help all the time. And that, as I said before, that was never kind of my thing. It was more of just family's too strong a word, but just building a group of people around you that you have good relationships with and are friendly with. And what's so interesting to me in my life is not, obviously not all of those relationships become helpful or last for a long time, but the ones that do are really incredible. And, you can not have talked to somebody for 10 years and then something comes across their desk, as I used to say in the old days, that, and they say, oh, William would be great for this. Let's call William. So I'm, eternally grateful for that. But I think, like I said, I credit my parents a lot with teaching me how to be social and growing up in a very social environment. And if you ever met my parents, a lot of people that meet my parents, they're still with me, praise the Lord, at 90 and 93. But they, we just went to an event in North Carolina with them. And my sister and I were trying to figure out like who would drive if they wanted to go home early. And then as we were standing there and we're the last people there, and my parents were deep in conversation with somebody as they took the tent down around us, my sister and I like, who are we kidding? Like, of course they're going to be the last people here. Yeah. That's just the way they are. They're excited to talk and excited to, so I luckily got some of that, which helps. It really does. I mean, you don't want to be overbearing. I'm sure some people are like, oh, fuck, here comes William. He's going to talk our ears off. But, I hope not. But anyway, yeah, I think it's nice that you've phrased your question that way, because it does make me think about how all these wonderful serendipitous things and so many things have come full circle in the time of my career, where, something that happened 30 years ago, I get the opportunity to work with that person again or do something. So it's really exciting. But I mean, advice wise, it depends on your personality, obviously, and what you like to do. But what's the old adage that just, showing up is half the thing? I think you have to be there. and I'm a social person, so I like to go out. It'd be hard for somebody, but in my Boston early New York days, I was out seeing a band like every night. I was a regular at CBGB's. I was everywhere, and that played a role because there was a group of A&R people that would roam the city from thing to thing. So I would tag along with them and go see bands and see a lot of bands at their infancy, and scramble to try to get involved. 90% of the time, not get involved. A lot of misses going through all that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just being there and having a positive outlook is the main thing.
And I like to say, when it comes to these interactions, not all interactions need to be viewed as, you don't need to treat them transactionally. It's more about making friends and allies that may turn transactional in the future or not, but they shouldn't be approached necessarily that way, because people can see bullshit and people who want to use their hard work from the beginning, I think.
Well, I think people in our business have their radar on. They have their radar on automatically.
Yeah,
You're like, oh, here comes somebody, and I've seen that in people's faces when I strike up a conversation, and I was never forceful. I always waited to be introduced. I mean, I did, Smokey Robinson walked into the room once and I gave him a big hug before I realized what I had done. But generally, I'm not impulsive like that. Yeah, that was a great moment. I'd had a few drinks, but he was very nice. He was very happy to see me.
He checked well.
No, he was totally in love with it, man. We chatted for a minute. He was like, "Hey," I think he thought he knew me. A lot of times people think they know you, and they're, when you come forward, they're like, "Oh, I must know this guy from somewhere."
Right.
But anyway. Yeah, and I think what you just said, I think, is important. The people that have stuck with me and been helpful to me throughout the years, I would consider friends more than a business relationship. And I think I approach every introduction as that. Like, that would be neat if you're like, head of a record label, if you throw me some work, but that's not really the reason I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you because you're an interesting person and you're head of a record label. Holy crap, that's super cool. Tell me stuff about you, or whatever. So I think it's approaching it that way, which just comes naturally. I mean, it's not something I think about, but it's that helps. And yeah, you're really making me go through the Rolodex of all the wonderful, helpful people that have been so nice to me. And I apologize for anybody's names I don't say or remember, but it's been a great situation that way.
Okay, so I keep talking about this Spotify thing. So let's talk about that, because that was a kind of it was a major point for you in your career.
It really was, and it relates to exactly what we were just talking about. So when I first moved to New York City, I met and still have a great friend named Vera Savsik. And Vera has always been on the business operations side of the music business. She ran TVT Records for a long time. She's now chief financial officer of the Secretly Group, which is a whole bunch of record labels. And we just remained friends since I met her like the second month I lived here, probably. And so we had a standing get together to go to the art shows. I'm very interested in fine art and do a lot of stuff with that. So go to the art shows at the Armory that happen every year, the big art shows where everybody shows art. So it's on the West Side. So you have to walk from, wherever you get off the subway, 53rd and 7th. So she had been working for another company that had been bought by Spotify. So she was working at Spotify. This was in 2016. And I didn't really know what Spotify was. I didn't listen to that much music. I'd gotten it because remember when it was only in Europe and you had to get an invitation from someone to get this new app? And so somebody had sent me something and I got it. But I would only go on and listen to it when somebody came out with a new record. I would like dial it up and listen to it. But so we're walking over to the thing and I'm like, "Oh, how's the Spotify gig going?" She goes, "Oh, it's good." She's telling me all about the gig and telling me what she's doing. And then all of a sudden she goes, "Wait a minute. You're the guy." I'm like, what do you mean I'm the guy? She goes, "You're the guy. Why didn't I think of this earlier?" And I'm like, "What's going on?" She goes, "Well, they just built an in-house recording studio at the 18th Street office. And they want us, this guy named Brian Groan has come up with a series called Spotify Singles, and they want to record artists there, but nobody knows how to make a record. Nobody's ever run a studio. Nobody knows how to do anything. So we're looking for that guy, and this would be like perfect for you. You've dealt with major artists. You've run your own recording studio. I mean, I still had Electrocraft at this time, one in New York and one in LA. Which was my post Sony ATV studio. So I was like, okay. So a week later, she introduced me to Brian. We talked, we go through some stuff. And then they basically offer me a part-time job to see, how we all get along. And I immediately start dismantling and rebuilding this studio. And then about 4 months later, they hired me full-time, and the rest is history. So we started the program. First recording session was Aoife O'Donovan, who I just saw last week at a Recording Academy thing. And from there went on to produce, record, and mix, or a various combination of those three things, and supervised, like 900 songs that have now garnered almost 10 billion streams. So again, it was an old friend, just happened to be going to do something that had nothing to do with music, and that came up. I'd been freelance for so long that I was super hesitant about taking the job. I actually sort of appreciated the part-time part. But as soon as I got there, I was like, oh, this has the potential to just be amazing, because it not only offered me the opportunity to create this program from scratch with Brian, but it, sort of redo that studio and make a lot of choices in terms of filling it with cool instruments for the artists, because they were usually all on the road when they came by. And, but just the level of artists that it allowed me to work with was phenomenal. So I knew within 6 months, like, this was a really good decision to make. And the LA studio had turned into quite a money pit for me, the Electrocraft there. And the landlord there was so sweet. He's the greatest guy. And he was like, I really want you to stay. What can I do to get you to stay? And I was like, well, the only thing you can do to get me to stay is not charge me rent, because that's the only problem, is I'm not making enough money to pay the rent. So it was very sweet of him. So anyway, I closed that, kept the New York one because the location was cool, and shared it with friends for a couple of years. But I knew immediately it was a good gig. And then, as they say, the rest is history. We made a lot of great recordings with a lot of amazing artists. We not only made that studio at 18th Street, a really amazing spot. We then did a 4-year residency at Electric Lady. Then we did an almost year residency at the Power Station. And then I got to build a beautiful studio, 2 studios from scratch in LA at their headquarters at Mateo. So a very large Studio A and a smaller Studio B that was set up for Atmos, and got to be involved in every bit of that project, from studio design and aesthetic choices to instruments to gear. And that was a phenomenal experience. And that studio won the Tech Award for studio design in 2023. So that was an amazing culmination of that gig.
Let me ask a bunch of questions to dissect this a little bit. So,
sure.
Broad overview, how long were you there?
For 8 years.
And in 8 years, the key part of the gig was recording high-level artists for Spotify exclusive releases.
Correct.
Okay.
And it was also a lot of up and comers as well. So it was a good mixture. It was all across all genres and every level, from, not quite beginning, but somebody who's doing okay, to, top stuff.
And you were doing this in not only house built, meaning Spotify house, like in like a headquarters studio, to Power Station, Electric Lady.
Right. Also traveled, did stuff at Abbey Road, did stuff in Nashville at Soundstage. That was our go-to spot there. And before we had the LA studio, we worked a lot at East West in LA. And
you were on salary.
Yep.
The scope of the sessions, like in a typical session, would it only last a day?
It was a 1-day session. So the way it worked is we would do extensive pre-production, but usually not directly with the artist. We would sort of lay out the idea. So the idea for a Spotify single is the A side of the single is a reworked version of one of your songs. And we would let the artist and the label decide whatever song that was that best fit into whatever their process was. Like if they were about to release a second single, sometimes it seemed that if they released a single and then they did an alternate version that came out 3 months later as that single was had peaked, that would lift interest in the single and be a new version. There were multiple strategies as to what worked best. And it was really the marketing people and the label people that we talked to about that. But I would really try to emphasize that by alternate version, I just didn't want to like take the piano out of the original version or, do something. I really worked hard to suggest different tempos, different genres, different keys, different arrangements.
So you would actually produce these sessions.
Yeah. And, I'd say, bring in the marching band, strings. If you don't use strings often, let's do that, whatever we can do. So, yeah. So it was a great, and, as of course with anything, certain artists were more open to that than others. Certain people would be too busy just to even think about it. And so we really got a variation of stuff that just sounds like the band playing their song that to other ones like taking it to a whole new level. And that was really great fun. And then the B-side was the cover song. So the cover song was also the band's choice. And, it was always fun if it related to something that, inspired their career. But a lot of times younger artists would choose like a Post Malone song or a Taylor Swift song, knowing that they would get attention from that, which is a viable way to get people to look at your stuff. And, if you did a Taylor song, Maggie Rogers did a Taylor Swift song, and then Taylor Swift, post on Instagram, this is a great song, Maggie. At that time in Maggie's career, that was a nice bump. So we'd look at all those things. And then we would get one day in the recording studio. So I would know what the instrumentation would be. We had a beautiful curated gear list of drums, basses, guitars. So the artists or their teams would pick out what they wanted to have. And we'd have all that set up the minute they walked in the door, everything, line checked and ready to roll. And then, basically everybody just walks to their stations and starts playing. We might have a little talk. The great thing is the gear in the studios that I had curated was so great that it gave you an instant talking point with the artist or the bands. Because they'd walk in and go, oh man, this 57 Gibson Country Western is gorgeous, which was actually my guitar. Thank you very much.
Great icebreaker.
Yeah. So it was a perfect icebreaker. And we'd send the gear list out and people would send back the next email. I go, holy shit. Like it made them think we knew what we were doing, because we had the right stuff for the gig. So it was great.
In your time in that 8 years, did some of those relationships culminate into outside involvement outside of Spotify for you?
Yes, they did. So a lot of people enjoyed that experience and would bring me in to do other projects afterwards. Most notably, Wynton Marsalis and Jon Batiste, and I'm trying to think of who else. There's a pretty good list of folks. So yeah, it was a great exercise for me in getting to know a lot of these people. Again, with the same interest, not as a transactional thing, but people on that level are incredibly interesting. Like, to spend a day with Joan Jett. I mean, come on, like how cool is that? And the music almost becomes, the music's amazing, but it also becomes secondary to that experience of just being with that person and getting to know that person. And so anyway, we would, and the cover song, what I was going to say, the cover song that's already going to be different than what they do. So you don't have to lead them to any production ideas on that stuff. You're just like, yeah, the cover is going to be different because you're covering someone else's tune. And some of those are fantastic. And some of those are way bigger than the A-sides because the covers are so unique and so interesting to that artist. So and then I would mix the tracks. Sometimes we didn't prescribe any method, how they did this. Some people that weren't people with live bands would come in with a bunch of tracks, and I would try to get them to like, let's sample our snare, or let's, use our organ, or let's make a weird sound with this synth and put it into, you put it into Logic and do whatever you want with it to try to get something. And that would work sometimes. And, but, as Spotify, we couldn't really prescribe. I would just say, look, we're making a record. So however you make a record, That's the way we're going to make the record. If you come in and sing the song into your laptop and leave and have your team put it together that you trust and love, great. That's fine. If you want us to mix it, great. You want, our mastering guy is standing by, but if you have a mastering guy, all good. So it was a very, we didn't push anything on anybody, but the mixing process was great for me because it, in the beginning it was frightening, dealing with, I remember when I did the band War on Drugs, Brian, who worked with me, was a big fan. He goes, these guys are super, super picky about everything. It took them 2 years to make their last record. And I was like, great. Now I've got to mix this thing, and they got to mix 2 songs in 2 days and send it in. So, I did my best, sent it in, and they just sent back and said, this is great. Thank you very much. And he was like, that's amazing. So those were the good days. But what the process was, and what I always explained to them beforehand, was this is a collaborative mix effort. I'm going to do a mix, send it to you. You tell me what you like, what you don't like. I'll fix it. I'll do multiple revisions until it gets insane. Then we might have to have a talk. But, and so it was great because the general, I remember when I sent out my first mix, I can't remember who the band was. It might have been Kaleo, the band from Iceland. But I was mixing in this new room at Spotify, and I didn't know the room at all. I didn't know anything, I didn't know. So I was would take it home or listen to it on headphones, try to figure out if it, and I was just so worried that it was going to come back and go, why is there no bass on this? Or it's so bright, it broke the windows in my car. I didn't know what I was mixing. So when the first one came back and they were like, yeah, can you just turn the vocal up a little bit, that second line of the third verse, and otherwise it's great. I was like, yes, I'm in. So, but the process was really, really, really fun for me. Some people I think that mix and do things are very no, I think this is right. And it gave me the opportunity to say, hey, you're the artist. I mean, a couple of times I would say, you really sure you want to do this? Or, this sounds kind of out of whack to me, but very seldom. Because again, working for a big company, you had to be sort of politically minded as to how you spoke to folks because you were representing this company, not just yourself. And that falls right into my wheelhouse of how I behave generally anyway. And I've never forced anything on anybody in a production sense or said, you have to do it this way or I'm walking out of the room. Mm-hmm. That's just not my style. So it worked out really, really well and sort of was a perfect fit assignment for me in terms of, being the face of it, being the host, being the producer, being the facilitator for whatever creative adventure you wanted to go on, and just making sure that by the time you walked out of the door at the end of the day, you'd had an incredible experience. And in the beginning of it, there are a lot of people that were, there are a lot of people still upset with Spotify, especially at this moment. They just changed some things that people don't like. But, there are some haters that would come in just because their managers were like, you have to go, do this thing. And they would have done the Today Show that morning at 5:00 and be irritated and pissed off and come in. And, my goal was by the end of it, we'd all be hugging and kissing. And we were, 99.9% of the time, everybody left wow, that was really fun. Thanks. And
but
so that was good.
You were hesitant in the beginning because it was did you see it as kind of a corporate gig and were potentially afraid of not having the free reign and autonomy that you desired?
Yeah. I had been freelance so long. I'd run my own studios. So I'd really called my own shots for better or for worse. That's an up and down business in a big way.
Absolutely.
And I was just so in that world that having a job, I was like, but then, I did a little research and they're a Swedish tech company. They give you 20 days vacation. I've never been on salary my whole life. So I thought, this is cool. I'll see what that's like. And, getting a check, getting a deposit into your account twice a month is pretty cool.
And so for doing what you love to do anyway,
right?
High-level artists with someone else's money.
Right. And it would have been a huge mistake if I'd said no, because the level of expertise I got to bring to these things sharpened my skills enormously. Yeah. And then the level of artist and musician I got to work with was also a blessing. So it was, I knew like 6 months, I was like, why did I even consider not doing this?
So let me ask you something. This might be a little psychological. Do you think that because of the autonomy they gave you, the freedom to do what you do, had it been a gig where you just show up and you're like the house guy that just records a band and then they come in and out? Like I've done that at a radio station, and it's just kind of like, it's not a glorious job. It's interesting, but do you think that there's a little bit of you that needed to kind of, I don't know, remain unique, you remain special in the situation, and this gave you that moment to shine?
I think so. I think it gave me, the real opportunity it gave me was the ability to, when I saw the opening and knew it was okay to get deeper involved in a production set, to do that with the artist on any level. And I think that was exciting. And because we had a creative goal with the actual series, like it wasn't just like you're just going to come in and record something. It was like, we want to make it different. And that was from the beginning of the program. That was the idea. Because with streaming, you don't want a copycat version of the same song on the platform. What's groovy and exclusive about that? So I think that was part of it. So yeah, it gave me the opportunity to be more of a producer in the situations, but also honed my diplomatic skills at knowing when, if a band hires, like I just did a record with this wonderful rock band and they hired me to be their producer. Therefore, all day I'm like, no, don't play that guitar. Let's try this guitar. No, don't do this. Let's move this to here. How about if we take that section and put it at the end of the song, on full, all cylinders producer. But with these folks, I had to sort of judge it as to how the pre-production went, what was happening. So sometimes my role was just to make sure they were comfortable and happy, and make sure that the producer they brought with them is happy, or the engineer they brought with them is happy. So I think that was the hospitality part of it, made a lot of people really comfortable, even if I wasn't super involved in the production. But it did give me, and Spotify's a tech company.
Yeah.
So my team of 2 or 3 were the only people in the company doing this. So we really could do it the way, we basically, the band would come in, do their meet and greet with some executives or whatever, and shut the door. And then we were just in a regular old recording session that like nobody outside that door had any idea what we were doing, which turned out to be part of the problem toward the end of the time I was there, is nobody knew what I was doing. But anyway, it gave us a certain, we just shut the door and made these great records with these, you get to work with Brandi Carlile right as she's breaking, to get to work with Phoebe Bridgers right as she's breaking, to get to work with Sting, with, it's just like, it's ridiculous. It was just insane.
And I'll go back just to the radio station thing. I mentioned KFOX used to be a really great radio station in San Francisco that's no longer with us. It was not the same level of commitment, or the same level of involvement, I should say. I too got to work in those positions where it was like, hey, Brandi Carlile is coming through. Who's Brandi Carlile? Oh, okay, we're going to record them.
Amazing.
But then you had, legacy bands like Robert Cray or The Fix, or Florence and the Machine. Incredible situations. Almost, kind of like I think Josh Rogosin, who just stopped doing the NPR desk concerts.
Right. Tiny Desk. Yeah.
Desk. Sorry. It was like a step below what Josh was doing. Very interesting. Why did you leave?
They did a round of layoffs, and so I was laid off in early December with 1,500 other people in one day, after they'd laid off, I don't know, over 1,000 people earlier in that year. And I think that, no real details. I just think that they were peering off from doing any kind of original content stuff. And so the program was pretty much diminished. And so, I look back at it as an incredible opportunity. All the artists I got to work with, and also the building of the studio was great, because that was really, I've been doing this a long time, and it was like somebody handing you the golden ticket and saying, build your dream studio. Who should design it? Who should do this? What kind of console should we get? All that kind of stuff. And I was blessed with an incredible boss named Chris D'Angelo, who came to Spotify as head of studio operations. And he came from building all of the YouTube spaces all around the globe. So I remember YouTube went on a big thing where they were going to invite all their content creators in and give them video space to make stuff. And so he built them in like Tokyo and Brazil and everywhere. And so by then, the original team that had done Spotify singles was gone. I was sort of doing things dotted a line across to people in more administrative gigs at Spotify. And I was about to get introduced to this guy, Chris. And I thought, this could be it. Like, am I going to be involved in LA? Am I not going to be involved in LA? What's going to happen? So Chris, we get on a Zoom call, and I guess it was like 2019, it was before COVID. And he turns out to be a guy closer to my age than most people at Spotify. And, he's just a great guy. And we talked for a minute and he goes, look, I don't really know about building audio studios. I know video and I know construction and I know this and I know that. I know how to deal with clients and how to deal with people. But everybody tells me you're the guy. So what do you want to do? Let's do it. And that started this unbelievable 5-year relationship where, first thing we did was, I took him to Abbey Road and to other places. I took him to East West. I introduced him to Candace and Paula and all the people in LA. And we went to see all the studios and we just took note of every great thing of every studio. Then, I introduced him to the people at Rupert Neve Design and, he and Josh and I would go hang out. We just had the best time, and it wouldn't have worked on a scale if there wasn't somebody who understood what it takes to be creative and what kind of environment you need for people to be creative in. And that's why the studio is a great studio. And we were talking with designers and I introduced him to John. I said, there are basically two people that could do this, either John Storick or the guy whose name I always forget, who sadly passed away. I can see his face. Anyway, great studio designer. Sorry, I forgot your name. And, John was very into doing it. So we all got together and, we just built this incredible, I've known John for a long time. He built the 18th Street studio before I was involved in Spotify, but I've worked in a bunch of his rooms over the years. And anyway, it was really a dream project. And it took us, because COVID intervened with the building of it and everything, but it took us about 3.5 or 4 years. But we filled it with incredible vintage instruments and gear and, a real mixture of old school and new school technology. Rupert Neve Design 5088, 48 channel board that we custom designed, just really, really, really cool stuff. So that was a great opportunity as well.
I was going to say, so this Spotify stop was truly a highlight in your life.
Yeah.
Leaving, once you're out of there and you're back, you're back freelancing.
Yep.
Big range of emotions, I bet, kind of.
Yeah. In a way, I mean, I poured my heart and soul into that job. And I know the people, especially at the top level of that company, know that. Yeah. And I understand, they were making big decisions about, how the company wasn't profitable. And, this was not a profitable enterprise. Spotify couldn't own the masters, couldn't and shouldn't have owned the masters to any of these recordings because they're, they can't ever be a record company. And so, part because of their deal with the labels. But so, the program and myself became a line item. And I understand that. It's a tech company.
Right.
It's not a music company. So it was definitely a life change for me. But I, got a lot of love from folks in our world and have so far worked on some incredible projects since leaving that are as good or better as anything I would have done there. And getting back to producing a band full on, as opposed to just having a one-day situation, to have 7 days with the band to cut 5 songs was great fun.
Did you reestablish a new home base studio?
Well, I'd always been based in New York. So right now I'm in the process. I'm talking to you now from a studio on the way on the Upper East Side in Spanish Harlem at this point. remains nameless. I'm trying to get the guy to change the name, but this is a possibility here. One of the first sessions I did post Spotify was a film soundtrack with Jon Batiste. We did that at the Power Station, which was great because it was basically the old team that was helping me out before, and I was able to bring in my wonderful engineer, Carl Blaspoka, who was there with me. So that was great. So, but for now, I'm probably going to put together a little mix room in my building that I have in Long Island City, and do mixing from there. And then for tracking and stuff, we'll see where the artist can and wants to go. But there's plenty of great choices. Right before I left the Power Station, I've been asked to look at other options that were less costly because they were trying to cut cost. Mm-hmm. So got to tour, Studio G, Electric Garden, trying to remember all the names, The Bunker, all these great studios in Brooklyn that I had, since I was cocooned at Spotify for 8 years, I hadn't really been bouncing around to all these other cool studios. And the studio in LA is still running for Spotify. So what few projects they do will still be done there. But did
you consider moving to LA at all as to make a even bigger change?
I'm kind of a New York guy. So I think if I got offered something, I'm talking to the other DSPs about, programs that they have. And, it's a weird time for every label and DSP because they're laying off people left and right. So, not sure if a full-time gig again interests me or not. So really in a real thoughtful but very positive stage. It's when you have a big life change like that, sometimes it can make you have a few just pull your covers over your head moments. And of course you have those in the beginning, but I spent some great time in LA around NAMM and the Grammys where we were talking, and you probably saw my energy and excitement of being there. I mean, it was great.
Oh,
and
yep.
I think there's a lot, I think there's an opportunity for bigger and better things to come down the line. So I'm just totally open to that, and will, be grateful for any help I get from, again, this great network of people that have helped me so much. And, I've got everybody to have their radar on right now. Have your William radar on. What's out there? What's doing?
The advantage of where you're at, I could see clearly. The time, your history, your experience, your network of people, and all the things that you've learned. You're now, it's almost like you're not at a blank slate, but you're at a point where you have so much awareness and knowledge of things that. Are you making decisions differently now than you did prior to joining Spotify and being very strategic about what you want to accomplish?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a calmness that comes with experience and age that is obviously part of you're not freaked out about every gig. And if you want something and you don't get it, you're sort of like, that's something else is going to come down the line, whatever. And I think the Spotify gig really honed my patience, and it really honed my ability to work with just an amazing variety of different people and to read them really well as to what they need to accomplish, what they want creatively. I mean, that's what excites me, is when somebody comes in with, some kind of a goal in their mind of what they want to get out of the day or the week, and you help them achieve that. I mean, to me, that's what producing is all about. It's not about prescribing your sound or your feel on top of what they're doing, although part of that helps because your experience and what you like basically leads you to recommend certain things to them, in terms of sonics and mixes and sounds. But I think the really exciting part is just when you look at each other at the end and you're like, wow, that was great. Like, we really made something that we can both be proud of, and it's very cool. So that's the fun part.
At this point in your life, have you developed, and especially going from freelance to a salary job back to freelance, do you have advice and or a personal financial philosophy about, like, how do you deal with money now at this point? You're probably not out like going, oh, I need to buy a bunch of new gear and I need to go into debt for that.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm super spoiled because for the last 8 years, I was on the best gear in the world. because I was picking it out and my engineers were picking it out. And, we were all commiserating on like, what would be the coolest thing to have? So, when I wandered off and had a laptop, I was like, oh shit. But I have some gear from my previous studios. So I've got some stuff, but you were just saying about buying stuff is like, my engineer, Carl, was like, okay, you're gonna have to buy these plugins. It's gonna be like $500. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Like, it was like I was feeling like super cheap all of a sudden because I just hadn't had to do that for so long. And but yeah, I mean, I think I'll rely on the bigger studios to keep, like the rack that's next to me that's got like everything I could ever dream of in it. I think but I'll just pick up a few oddball things. Like I just bought a Telray reverb and I get an oil can reverb and some old cool stuff. And one of the nice things we got to do in the Spotify world was work outside the box, especially in mixing. I had set up an incredible 2-bus analog chain, and I felt like it really made a difference. And I don't know how many people really noticed the difference, but kind of going back in the box for me was a little bit of a sad moment. Although I still feel like the stuff I've done since then that was more in the box was really good. But yeah, that's what I'll miss. But I don't really feel like I need to build a studio and spend that kind of money. And just in terms of financial life, God, I have no idea how I've survived this long. I look back to Boston days and was like, how did I eat, and have an apartment? And there are highs and lows, and you just have to be careful. I mean, I would think I'm a little more careful financially now, and especially in instruments and gear. I'm very thoughtful about any kind of purchases I'm going to make. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of what keeps you hustling. You got to make a living, and so yeah, there's no subsidies here, sadly.
Yeah.
It's like no matter what age and stage, and I'm not as young as I used to be, but nowhere near interested in stopping. Even if I was a zillionaire, I wouldn't stop because I just love, one of the things, the work with Spotify was so consistent. I was working all the time.
Right.
And when you're freelance, you're not working all the time. You do a project, got a couple of weeks, nothing's happening. Hopefully you pick up something else. So this for the Spotify for the second time in my life where I was doing stuff all the time, and because Sony was the first. But what it taught me was as you go through life, you try to figure out like where's my spot, like where's my happy place, where do I feel the most creative, the most engaged. And I realized that it's in the recording studio with an incredibly talented artist, helping them facilitate that moment of creativity. And sharing what with them and vice versa to make something. And that at the end of the day, you're just like, that was amazing. Like that was great. I pinch myself sometime, like, walking out of the studio after doing after spending the day with Shania Twain, who's the most energetic person who knows so much about music, and surrounded herself with incredible musicians for that day, including Ray Parker Jr., who I just love. You walk out at the end of that day and you're just like, she didn't want to leave. We just kept playing tracks and like hanging out. It's like, how cool is that? So it really taught me to appreciate those moments, be super grateful for those moments. And, even with the band I just produced, we worked 14 hours a day. And at the end of that day, it was like, wow, we got some incredible stuff done today. So it's exciting, but that's what keeps me going. When we were young, we all wanted to be zillionaire rock stars, but I think that ship has sailed for me.
Yeah. Well,
unless they're ambient music rock stars, that's all for me.
Well, it's hard to be a zillionaire rock star in this day and age.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so if people want to find out more about you, do you maintain a website?
I'm putting a website together now, and I think it's Electrocraft-William Garrett, but I haven't built the website yet because I don't have a resume. I never had a website either. And I don't have a Wikipedia page. I've just been too busy working. So all that stuff. I do have an Instagram, which is Electrocraft.
Okay.
And that leads people to some articles and things about some of this stuff. And but yeah, just sort of rebuilding that part of my life because I didn't need it for the last part of my career.
So for the listener, I'm going to include the Instagram account, and that will be the gateway to other things. So be sure to check that out. Wow, man, really great to talk to you and get this.
I only just got started, man.
I know. We got another 2 hours.
That's right. I know.
Well, I wish you luck in your freelance journey that you
Thank
are
you, man.
embarking on, and I will follow you and stay in touch with you as well to see what you're up to. So,
of course. And, I appreciate the lines of questioning that you drew out. It really made me think about some different things about the path and the people that have helped me out. So I have to go, make 20 phone calls and cry and tell people thank you.
And thank a bunch of people.
Exactly. Think about my people.
Not exactly making amends, but more like just,
No, most of them know how much I appreciate it. Yeah. So I think that's good.
Well, thank you for making time for me. It's
of course, man. Like
I said, great to chat with you, and I'll see you again when I see you. But until then, you take care.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt.